Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Beyond the Gatekeepers. I am Bishop Vanessa M. Brown. I'm your host and moderator for this evening. We are so very happy to have you here tonight, joining in with us on Facebook, on YouTube, on Instagram, on X, on LinkedIn, on all the places that we can be found. We are excited that you have decided to join us tonight. And I promise you that this is a very, very, very powerful show with a great author on tonight. And so I want you all to gather in, do me a great big favor, if you will, and share. Make sure that you share the Facebook Live or the YouTube or the LinkedIn or the Messenger. Even if people don't watch it now, they can watch it later. Put it in their messenger, let folks know. You can text it to their phone, however way you want to do it, so that people will know that this is a conversation that they should be a part of. And so we're excited about that. We're excited about this journey. And we want to know where you are watching from. So do us a great big favor again and make sure that you shout out where are you watching this show from on tonight. And again, it could be from anywhere in the United States. I just need to know that. And so I am excited that you're here tonight. Let me start off with who I see. And so right now I see Chuck Hunt from Monroe, Louisiana. I say good evening to you, Chuck. I see Albert Reed here from Colleen, Texas. Maria Harris is on YouTube from Denver, Colorado. We say welcome to you. Sean Jenkins is here tonight. Thank you, Sean, for joining us. Metro Atlanta is here. Monique Nelda is here from New Jersey. Welcome, Monique. Thank you for being on. Pastor Siegfried Benton from Temple Hills, Maryland. We say greetings to you, Pastor. Thank you for joining us tonight. Rebecca Brown is here from Phoenix, Arizona. She said, where it's beyond hot outside. I can imagine probably like above 100 degrees. And so we say welcome to you tonight, Rebecca. We hope you're staying cool. And we know that others are going to join us and are now, as you all are sharing, and I'm sharing as well, letting folks know, please come on and hear this conversation from this powerful author, powerful man of God. We are excited to have them here with you. Thank you very, very much. All right. Darlene Connell, welcome. Welcome to you. Queens, New York is in the house. Queens, New York is in the house. While other people are coming on, I just want to let you all know, I see you, Minister David. Minister David representing East Orange, New Jersey tonight by way of New York City. Lavinia Bean, welcome. Cape May, New Jersey is in the house. Jacqueline Trussell, thank you for being here on YouTube from Chicago, Illinois. Thank you for being here. A.V. Dub Spoon from Arkansas. Welcome, A.V. Thank you, Avi, one of the two. You'll correct me. From Arkansas. We're glad that you are here on tonight. Before I get into it, I want to let you know that Bishop Flunder will not be here with us on tonight. Unfortunately, well, I don't want to say unfortunately, God knows what God is doing, but Mother Lucky, many of you all may not know who Mother Lucky is, but Mother Lucky is was the mother of City of Refuge, one of the mothers rather, and very active, 97 years old, very active in the fellowship, very active at her home church, which is City of Refuge. Bishop Flunder is her pastor. So although she was 97, she was on the go. And if you have ever been to any fellowship gatherings or ever been to City of Refuge, then you've seen her. And so she transitioned the other day. And so Bishop Flunder and Mother Miller are settling with the family and with the City of Refuge family right now. And she asks that you please keep City of Refuge in your prayers. So those of you that know about prayer, please keep Mother Doris Lucky Allen and her entire family in prayer, as well as Bishop Flunder and City of Refuge. And I know that some people knew her. And so this is so wonderful. This is a blessing. I see you, Courtney Brown. Thank you for being here. Baton Rouge, Louisiana is in the house. So I wanted to let you all know, but we're going to still have a wonderful conversation on tonight. And again, do me a favor. make sure that you are sharing this conversation. Tonight, we have a guest. It is his first time with us, Dr. Terrence L. Johnson. He is the Charles G. Adams Professor of African American Religious Studies at Harvard Divinity School. He has written several books, but tonight, the book we're going to talk about is We Testify with Our Lives. We Testify with Our Lives. And so I want to introduce him to you all. I want him to say hello, and then we're going to bring on a clip that I want you to watch. Dr. Terrence, how are you?
I am wonderful. Hello, Bishop Brown, and to all the folks who've joined from all over the country. I'm really excited to join in the conversation. I hope this is an exchange. And again, we all have very busy lives. So again, I'm very honored that you would take time to join us.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your presence on tonight. Everybody, we want you to share really quickly. I see Reverend Karen Coleman is in the house. Boston is here. Bishop Levi Richards is on. God bless you. New York City, Harlem is representing. Our dear brother and friend, Dr. Quincy James Reinhardt is here. And so we say, God bless you, Dr. Quincy, as well. Pam Jones is here from Chicago, Illinois. We are welcoming you all tonight as you roll in. Sherry James from Reno is in the house. Reginald Nichols from Stockton, California. Dr. Terrence, they from everywhere. Okay. And Quincy Jones wants you, Quincy James Reinhardt says, Dr. Terrence L. Johnson, we see you.
Okay, well, thanks, my brother. It's good to have you on board. You should actually be talking, but hopefully next time.
Listen, Quincy helps me out with this show a lot.
Okay.
He sends me books. So you need to read this. You need to read that. You need to read this. Now, I already have my list of people. I said, Quincy, I got a list. He said, all right, add these to your list too. And so he is a brilliant scholar. Of course, I know that you know that already. And I know he's your Morehouse brother. So blessings to you all as well. Let's get to, and I'm sorry, Anthony White has just joined us. Central California is in the house. So we got people, you see that East Coast, the West Coast, the South, the Midwest, and then other people from different countries, they'll be coming in as well. So we want to appreciate them as well. Dr. Terrence, we want to situate the audience as it relates to your scholarship, and you have a video clip that Pastor Sue is going to show right now before we start the conversation.
Great, thank you.
I have written a poem for a woman who rides a bus in New York City. She's a maid. She has 2 shopping bags. When the bus stops abruptly, she laughs. If the bus stops slowly, she laughs. If the bus picks up someone, she laughs. If the bus misses someone, she... So I watched her for about 9 months. I thought, Now, if you don't know black features, you may think she's laughing. But she wasn't laughing. She was simply extending her lips and making a sound. I said, oh, I see. That's that survival apparatus. Now, let me write about that to honor this woman who helps us to survive. By her very survival, Miss Rosie, through your destruction I stand up. So I used the poem with Mr. Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem, Masks, and my own poem for old black men. Mr. Dunbar wrote Masks in 1892. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It shades our cheeks and hides our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts, we smile and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but oh my God, our tears to thee from tortured souls arise, and we sing. Hey, baby, we sing. Hey, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile. But let the world think otherwise. We wear the mask. When I think about myself, I almost laugh myself to death. My life has been one great big joke, a dance that's walked, a song was spoke. I laugh so hard, I almost choke when I think about myself. 70 years in these folks' world. The child I works for calls me girl. I say, yes, ma'am, for working's sake. I'm too proud to bend and too poor to break. So I laugh until my stomach ache when I think about myself. My folks can make me split my side. I laugh so hard, I nearly died. The tales they tell sound just like lying. They grow the fruit but eat the rind. I laugh until I start to cry when I think about myself and my folks and the little children. My fathers sit on benches. Their flesh count every plank. The slats leave dents of darkness deep in their withered flank, and they nod like broken candles, all waxed and burnt profound. They say, but sugar, it was our submission that made your world go round. There in those pleated faces I see the auction block, the chains and slavery's coffles, the whip and lash and stock. My fathers speak in voices that shred my fact and sound. They say, but sugar, it was our submission, and that made your world go round. They laughed to shield their crying. They shuffled through their dreams. They stepped and fetched a country and wrote the blues in screams. I understand their meaning. It could and did derive from living on the ledge of death. They kept my race alive by wearing the mask.
Thank you so much, Dr. Terrence.
No, thank you just for allowing me to situate our conversation and Dr. Maya Angelou's rendition of We Wear the Mask. It was interesting, delivered in 1988 at a conference on understanding evil. And, I think it's so powerful in part because often we see Black conditionality in this country, right? What many call the afterlives of slavery and enslavement itself, right? As this kind of social system, as orientation of how we forcibly, right, submit a people, right, to a brutality beyond words. And yet, that does not speak to the ways in which, right, there was a kind of a fancy way of calling it kind of ontological framing of Blackness as the negation of whiteness, as subhuman, right, as criminality. And what I found so powerful about Angela's rendition of We Wear the Mask, right, is the extent to which, one, she calls slavery evil. Two, she recognizes that there is something called a Black interiority, that while we were enslaved physically, that there was another part of us, whether literal or metaphorical, that did not face enslavement. And I would say all of my life, right, I've always been in awe of how my family, in particular my grandmother, who was a day worker, a janitor at a state's hospital, how she, in many ways, wore so many masks as she engaged both white folk at her job, as she engaged Black people at her church who called her sister, who gave her a level of respect and dignity, of the ways in which she opened her home as a kind of place of hospitality for folk who were moving north, right, from Mississippi, from Alabama. And yet, despite the ways in which the social world condemned her as a woman, right, for being Black, for being, quote, uneducated, there was this kind of reservoir of love, right, that surrounded our family, right? Amidst all the brokenness within our family as well, there was a way in which I saw in all of my relatives this kind of deep navigation ability, right, to put their very best, even as they faced a world that attempted to destroy them every day. And so my prayer has always been that if I were to become a professor,
Mhm.
that I wanted to try to give life to that Black interiority.
Yes.
And and that's been my prayer. And it's hard, right? Because in part because the world wants to tell you, well, there's no interiority, right? It's
Yes, sir.
only a figment of our imagination. I would argue that, well, our survival, right,
Yes.
depended upon a kind of interiority. And also I want to argue that our interiority was always sometimes in conflict with the quote church,
Mhm.
sometimes in conflict with those of us who were Muslim, those of
Yeah.
us who were practitioners, say, of African indigenous religions. And
Mhm.
so part of what this book, in many respects, but also I say my work in general, is trying to explore the ways in which Black interiority is always in conversation, sometimes in conflict with, sometimes informing how institutional religions, right, shape our lives. But more importantly, how institutional religions are simply one aspect of our spirituality. And I
Yes.
think the hard part is that the assumption is, well, if you somehow only see Christianity or Islam, right, or Judaism as one aspect of your life, that somehow you are picking and choosing, right, what is best for you outside of the context of this great God. And I would argue that, well, we're always making complicated decisions based on our social lives. And so I want my students, and I try to struggle with this idea, well, how do we understand tradition, this big thing writ large, even as we struggle to make sense of it? And by struggling to make sense of it, we are in some ways, quote, tainting, we are extending, we're stretching the text, we're stretching traditions all the time. And I want folks to, especially those who are not in the academy, to say, look, anytime you raise a question about, man, God, why did this happen? Or why did the pastor come to church drunk? I remember as a kid, sometimes one of my pastors would come to church. Everyone knew he was liberated, but they were like, okay. And they would accept him, they would embrace him, and
Mhm.
yet still criticize him. And I always wonder, well, how can we hold so many tensions and
Yes.
still call ourselves, oh, we're sanctified or we're
Mm.
set apart? And
Mhm.
to me, that speaks to the beauty of who we are as a people. And yet, oftentimes, when we are presenting ourselves to a world in which we're already subhuman and criminal, we don't present that nuance. We're like, oh, no, everything's black or white. Because in many respects, our survival depended upon having a kind of respectability that mirrored, right, the American kind of canon. This idea of pulling yourself up on your bootstraps, being respectable people, and striving towards a middle class dream. And yet, when you look at ordinary practices of Black folk, particularly in the rural South, regardless of the religious tradition, they were always grappling and interrogating the text. And I just want to tell people, well, what if we embrace that as a part of our tradition? Not only the whole thing, but what if we embrace part of it? Maybe then it might force us to rethink rigid rules that force people out.
I'm so glad that you brought up interiority and respectability. But before I go further, I see people. This, first of all, we are talking to Dr. Terrence L. Johnson. His book is We Testify with Our Lives. And Pastor Sue is going to pop that up on the screen really quickly so you can see it and put in the chat how you can purchase it and all of the things that you need to do in order to get the book. And then he has so graciously agreed to give away a book on tonight. And so we're going to make sure that we're putting the hashtag in Beyond the Gatekeepers, right? So you've got a free book giveaway. Let's see that book up close, Pastor Sue. We Testify with Our Lives. And a powerful book for people to read. And I want us to delve into it. And then I also want to acknowledge Colette Walker. I want from St. Louis, Missouri. I want to acknowledge so many people, so many people. Okay, so you see it in the chat. Marlene McLaurin, Bishop from Unity Fellowship Church Movement in Baltimore, Bishop Sonia Williams from Atlanta, Cheryl Robinson Moore, O'Fallon, Missouri, Dr. Stacy May, Bronx, New York, Rhonda Height, St. Louis, Natasha Robinson, Professor Natasha Robinson, Chicago, Illinois, Pastor Erica Smith Maynor, York, PA. Welcome, 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 everyone. Welcome. You see the name of the book. We're telling you how to purchase it. It's already in your chat. Sir Isaac Nelson, we say good evening to you as well. And we're also going to do a book giveaway. You mentioned interiority. And I'm thinking about the fact, I think about my own mother and my grandmother. They had that interiority. They had that kind of fortitude. Dean Lawrence Carter Sr. is watching, just so you
Oh
know.
my goodness.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
They
hello,
have
Dean.
kind of fortitude, and Elliot Morris also from Chicago, where, living through Jim Crow, learning how to navigate that world, right? Uh, um, living through, all kinds of racial discrimination, they were able to do it and still keep that, like Maya Angelou just talked about, right? Still keep that about it, but still keep the family strong, right? Still have ways that had pushed us forward in the world and that lifted us up. Like, no matter what they were going through, we were not going to stay in those spaces and places. They would not allow it, right? And so I find that very, very powerful that you talked about that. And I want to lean into the book, more of the book, right? Because just your prologue alone can be a book by itself. It really can. It's so powerful. The prologue, you take words, short words, non-short words from Audre Lorde, um, which I believe transformed how Black people saw themselves nearly 2 decades after the birth of the Black Power movement. What does she say? She says the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Can you tell us more about that and how that situates your storytelling and all of the proof and all of the ways in which you have for us to read and understand?
Sure. No, thank you, Bishop Brown. I wanted to, in some ways, begin with Lord in part because she's such a disruptive figure within Black Christianity, um, within Black communities, and among Black men. And I wanted to show that one can remain strong, one can remain committed to faith, one can grow deeper in love, right? By embracing women, by embracing Black feminist thought, by embracing a Black lesbian woman. And, the master's tools, everywhere I go, it's when I was in grad school conference, I would hear particularly the women talk this idea of the master's house and the tools and the Lord. And I wanted to try to complicate the degree to which, well, what does that really mean? Does it mean we can't dismantle the tools, or does it mean that we can't do it without community, right? And Louis R. Gordon really helps complicate this whole notion. What does she mean by the very house? And part of what I want to argue is that we have always, right, disrupted the master's tools in part because we've always introduced new tools to the concept. And I want to argue that in many respects, there is no master's house, right, without
Mm,
the enslaved Africa. There's no master's house without, right, understanding African origins, right, in Ghana, in Egypt, right,
yes.
in the Sudan. And so I don't want us to see ourselves as so distinct and apart from Western modernity and from the rise of enslavement. And I wanted to show that we can critique this idea of the master's tools and still use it, right, as a conversation piece, in part because the ways in which we've used the Bible or the Quran, for example, have been so disruptive, even as we've maintained patriarchy, even as we've
Disruptive
maintained
and
very
destructive.
homophobic, right,
Yes.
um, structures. And so my friends often say, well, but then why do you return to the text?
Mm,
And I'll be honest with you, I don't have a clear answer other than that we see the book, right, as Alan Callahan tells us, as a kind of talking book. And I want to claim that this idea that we've always had a dialogical relationship with the text.
yes.
And if we would embrace that, I think then how we then interpret it, right, through our hermeneutics, right, I think would create a richer kind of context. And again, I think even with all of the brokenness within our institutions, right, I want to argue that I don't want to simply dismiss it. I want to critique as a way, right, to showcase, right, the kind of the love within the rubble, right. And I
Mm,
know it's a terrible phrase right now, given what's going on um, in Gaza, but
yeah.
that in the midst of our brokenness, right, there are still these epistemic resources that we can claim. And my fear is that if we don't claim them, right, we are never going to go through the process, as I later talked about with Tony K. Bambara, of actually healing, because we'll be running away from dread and despair, from a past that Toni Morrison tried to say, well, look, we spent enough time trying to bury African enslavement. Now it's time to embrace it. And so I now want us to return to, in some ways, the brokenness of our religious traditions
Yes.
as a way to recover a kind of love, because right now we're in a moment in which the planet is literally right on fire.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we really learned the lessons from Black Lives Matter. 'Cause I don't know if we fundamentally believe that our lives matter, because we are constantly facing the onslaught of white supremacy. We're constantly getting beat down. And I wonder at this moment, as we ponder another potential presidency of misogynists and racists, how do we then again recover that love as a way to reify us during a moment in which our existence is under threat?
Dr. Terrence, and to our audience, first of all, we are listening to Dr. Terrence Johnson. The name of the book, Pastor Sue is going to put it up, is called We Testify with Our Lives, How Religion Transformed Radical Thought from Black Power to Black Lives Matter. I promise you that you want to purchase this book. It's already listed in the chat, but I also want you to try to win a copy of the book, which Dr. Johnson has so graciously agreed to give a copy away by putting hashtag Beyond the Gatekeepers. Dr. Johnson, your first chapter starts off with the politics of healing. And so the soul eaters, you talk about, you just mentioned him and you were already leading us in that direction, Tony K. Bambara, and he basically talks about the fictional South, southern town of Claiborne a few years after the Civil Rights era and Black Power movement. Lead us down the road, not all the way, but lead us down the road and where you would want us to be at as it relates to the politics of healing.
Sure. So Salt Eaters was published by Tony K. Bambara in 1980. And a good friend of mine who was involved in Newton said, well, when she published the book, Black power folk were livid, in part because they're like, how can you expose our secrets? And I'm like, well, what secrets, my friend, are you talking about? She was like, the idea that these radical Black men, that many of these church-going women, were involved, engaged in esoteric practices, like divination, going to diviners, yes, healers. And the reason why I think it was so, in some ways, outlandish for folk to read was in part because people try, like men, but in particular, Silke Carmichael and others, try to frame Black powers through a kind of very masculine lens, that in some ways rejected that old folk religion, rejected any claims around, Christian morality, to frame our political activism. And this incredible novel really speaks to all the complicated ways and also the kind of the moments of genius within our community, that emerge even in the midst of suffering, even as people are recovering from the onslaught of Black power, that they are turning to resources that in many cases were prior to African enslavement. They have either recovered through memory, recovered through rigorous reading of history, I mean, Black power is cynic. These people who were involved in these movements, they weren't simply just protesting, they were organizing, they were reading texts, They were engaging in texts that were written by Fanon, authors who were not based in the US, and yet trying to make sense of race as a US problem that was actually a signifier of a global problem around race. And so I felt as if Bambara did an extraordinary job of really bringing in the ways in which religion and politics collide, overlap, and create the kind of ruptures, that create the conditions for our healing. And I wanted to really focus on it, and I think I could have done a better job at this, but to show how political so-called progress or political emancipation will mean nothing if we have not gone through our own individual and collective healing. And I would argue that's where we are now. This question, what is healing? What does it look like?
So I want to say, I want to push a little bit more because I want you to say more about these community healers. These people that were diviners and that could see. Of course, in the Black church, we would call them prophetic,
Sure,
or that
sure.
they had the gift of prophecy and they could see or they could foretell or forthtell something. Say more about that.
Sure. Well, in the novel, Velma Henry really is a sort of central character along with Minnie Ransom. And the text opens with this whole idea of, Velma Henry has attempted, suicide that's gone awry. And she's really struggling with, right, what does she do now? What do we do as a people now
Yes.
that we've had decades of struggle, decades of what we thought were political victories,
Hmm.
and now it all has collapsed, right? As we approach an era in which individualism has just gone nuts and gone crazy, and folk have, in some ways, turned away from King's beloved community, and we see the rise, right, of these sort of mega black churches who were historically claiming that, well, King really wasn't a black minister in part because he just talked about politics. We need now people to talk about our well-being, but their well-being was always aligned with one's prosperity, what one's sort of material success,
Hmm.
and those things are important. But what we missed, I think, between let's say 68 and even 98, right? Particularly as we think about sort of the Clinton rise of the Clinton administration, where folk were like, "Oh, he's our first black president," right?
Right.
Based on the ways in which he quote diversified the administration, was
Hmm.
that we never dealt with this notion that our own state tried to kill us. Our own state infiltrated many of our civil rights organizations
Yes.
in an effort not simply to monitor and to help, but to monitor, disrupt, and destroy. And
Yes.
so there's this moment in which I think the crack epidemic, in some ways, is nurtured by our inability to really sit with this idea of the state violence against us. And then we immediately turn to this idea of black on black crime without sitting with the healing part. And so the novel does a great job, right, of situating a community of people who are wrestling with many of the same issues, but instead of turning to their legislator or instead of just going to their pastor or going to a psychologist, they're going to healers, right? They're going to people who are going to the very source, right?
Yeah.
The kind of the source of African indigeneity as a way to think about what does healing look like. And again, it's not one thing, but it's this acknowledgement of our brokenness.
So possibly and maybe that is something that we should do now, right? We should, many of us have already, but many, still vilify and demonize African indigenous religions. But perhaps there should be a turning where we can get all of our stuff back, right? We can go back to those ways and still have what we have now. It doesn't have to be a either or, it can be a both and.
No, I agree. And I think in many cases we have it, right? Because many of the churches that are dying because of what? The music.
Yes,
And the music, right, is the one source that's undeniably African, right? And
absolutely.
undeniably a certain kind of spirituality, representation of a certain kind of spirituality. And so um I think we have to first name it as yes, it is the Holy Ghost, it is
Yeah,
shouting, but it's also maybe potentially a ring shout. It's also this idea of being possessed, right,
yes,
by an ancestor. And so,
yes,
and what does that mean? And again, people get real creepy about the word ancestry, and yet, I would argue that I can go to any black home, particularly where the parents have some, origins from the South,
hmm,
and I can point to the ways in which their lived experience undermines the rigidity of Christianity, whether it's
absolutely.
playing the numbers,
Hmm.
whether it's this idea you have a dream,
Get
you
it.
call an
Better
elder.
say it. Yes, that's
When you
true.
get sick,
Yep,
we don't call the doctor. We say, "Oh, well, let me first try these three remedies."
absolutely. 100%.
and then we'll and even folk who are educated, right, so-called educated, right,
Yeah,
when we get a diagnosis that our child has ADHD, what do? We
right.
call men and women of faith and say, "Can you
That's
pray
right.
for us?"
Hmm.
We look for alternative ways of dealing with right, or any kind of neurological difference
Absolutely.
before we actually turn to quote science and medicine. And
Yeah.
so I think again, claiming how we live our lives,
Yes.
I think is the first step of embracing our connection to a kind of African indigeneity.
Absolutely. I can tell you. I'm not gonna name no names, but my family members believe the play of the numbers. Okay.
Yes,
And
yes,
living in New York City, you could play the numbers in the Bronx, Manhattan, Brooklyn, and
yes.
Queens. Right?
Oh, to this day,
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Well,
I'm
well
from
look, even
Harlem. You can
when I
still
talk
play.
to
I mean,
Dean,
it's illegal to it's the illegal, it's the illegal
yeah.
numbers,
Well,
but
even when
it can be
I
done.
talk to Dean Carter, who's online, and when I
Yes.
talk to him, it's interesting because I'm like, okay, Dean, I want to hear your vision because I
Yeah.
know you can see things and hear things based upon your age, but also based upon your experiences. And so whenever I talk to the elders, I'm always looking for, okay, what are they interpreting and seeing that I don't see? And I think in many respects, that's what so many of us are looking for, right? And we can't name it, but that's like going to a seer or diviner. I mean, you're wanting people to kind of interpret what these signs and symbols are. And right
Yes.
now we're at a moment where how do we make sense of we have a black woman who's vice president,
Yeah.
and yet she is so erased from the
Erase.
public imagination. And
Erase.
when her name is invoked, many people demonize her and criticize her.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, many of those folk look like us. And the question I'm having is, okay, I agree you may not like her politics. And yet, what have we done structurally
Yeah.
to hold her accountable?
Yeah.
And so part of what this idea of community that Bombard talks about, because she calls herself a kind of cultural nationalist and a kind of womanist, right, is that we talk a lot about community, but I'm not sure we actually live it. Right? We
Yes.
love to acknowledge those who quote made it over,
Mm-hmm.
right? Those who are quote successful, those who have been validated,
Yeah.
right, by the white normative gaze, as Colonel West would call it.
Yes.
And yet we don't have the relationship with those people to hold them accountable. We
Right.
don't have the structural relationship to say, let me support you when you're being attacked, but also when we think you're like going astray, we're also going to hold you accountable. And I think part of what the community that Bombara was imagining is this idea that we can't simply talk about community rhetorically, but we've got to find ways to develop it and to nurture a community so that, for example, now that I'm at Harvard, there should be dozens of people who are saying, Terrence, this is what I expect from you.
Yeah. I hear you.
And I can tell you right now, maybe one person from my extended kind of sort of tribes, as it
Yes.
were, folk who've guided me, one person has called to say, here's what I think you did wrong yesterday in the speech, and here's how I think you can improve. It's like people are happy when you quote make it, and yet what they don't realize is that making it to the mountaintop, as it were, is so dangerous because you are out there and you are exposed, right?
Yes.
And my mentor once said, brother, you don't want to just stand on the mountaintop. You better fly because if you don't fly, all kinds of shots will come after you. And so I'm hoping that Bombara will show us how, when we talk about community, we have to nurture the people. And as we nurture, we have to show them how we expect accountability. Doesn't mean you have to follow everything that we say, but I can tell you there are other communities of folk that when they support you, when they send you to the White House, they say, here are expectations. Now,
Yeah.
maybe you can't meet all 10, but we expect you to fight for 5.
Absolutely. I love that. I love that. Let me keep moving. I see people are chiming in. You know that we give you an opportunity to ask questions as it relates to this book or this particular subject matter. You have to write the word question first, and then we can see it easily, and we will see to it that we ask those questions. Dr. Terrence, uh, Awakening to Black Power Consciousness. Stokely Carmichael, one of the premier figures in the Black Panthers movement, cried out Black Power in 1966. People really didn't know what to do, what to do with that, right? Preaching liberation and all of the things that he was doing, not really involved with the church, right? In a lot of ways, they did things that the church should have been doing, right? In my opinion, in, in a lot of ways, they could have worked collectively. At some point, they did along the way, but it kind of started off a little rough. Tell us about Carmichael and
Sure, sure.
some of the Black activists during that time in terms of awakening the Black Power consciousness.
Sure, sure. No, I mean, and I think it's really important to understand. Look, Carmichael is sort of, sort of grows up intellectually in New York, right, among very sort of leftist white Jews, right.
Absolutely.
Goes off to Howard University, where he's again surrounded by a lot of really smart brothers and sisters, many of whom are Christians, right, folk who are debating Christianity and its role in Black politics. And as we all know, Clayton Powell and others actually articulated the notion of Black power well before Carmichael.
Right.
And yet, I want to argue that Carmichael's his sort of rhetorical stance, right, the ways in which he engages community is very much in line with sort of the Black preacher, right? The Black preacher who has moral authority. We know that he's mentored by King. We know that
Yes.
he's going back and forth with these Black preachers. And even though institutionally the church is not necessarily out there, there are a number of Black women, particularly the women at Alabama State University, right, who were involved with the Montgomery bus boycott movement that King was involved with. These women had political sort of committees that were funding and helping to support Montgomery bus boycott, who were many of whom were directly tied to churches. And so even though institutionally we weren't involved, part of what I want to argue is that the fragments of our faith commitments were right there in the movement. And in many respects, right, we all know that when Malcolm X delivered most of his major speeches, they were in Black churches, right? We think about Mr. Louis Farrakhan, when he delivered most of his speeches, where they're in Black churches. And yet, even though we have this, again, very kind of public conservative position, we're always teetering back and forth with the kind of Black nationalism and Black consciousness. And so I want to argue that he awakened something that both troubled all of us, even King, in terms of, well, look, politically, I don't agree, but spiritually and sort of socially, I agree with it. But I want to make sure we can achieve these pragmatic goals before we start talking about so-called Black power. And I think in part, I think the debate was whether or not, well, is Black power, are you calling that out so that white folk can give it to you? Or are you actually calling out for Black folk? And if you're calling out for Black folk, well, why didn't you do it at the juke joint? Why do you do it within our churches? Just like one might argue with Black Lives Matter. I remember a professor I know from Morehouse was like, I love the phrase, but are you saying Black Lives Matter to Black folk? Because I'm at Morehouse. They matter to me. They've always mattered for the last 45 years since I've been teaching. So the question becomes, when we have these rhetorical stances, right, that in some ways I think voice a deep cry, we have to ask all kinds of questions to say, okay, to whom is the person talking? Right.
Mhm.
And at what point are we within our own institutions, right, attempting to manifest the very goals that we articulate in public sphere? And I'll give one example. Cornel West, I used to disagree with him, but now I think he's correct. I argue that there are two primary sort of notions of genius in the Black community. One is Black preaching, and the other
Right.
is jazz, in part because those two traditions were formed and fashioned, right, within the Du Boisian veil, right, that they were what determined their veracity, right, their viability, their power, had everything to do with what Black folks thought. It
Right.
had anything to do with anybody else. And so part of what I was trying to wrestle with is, are we developing a consciousness, right, within the confines of spaces that we control, where we feel comfortable,
Mhm.
where we are wrestling with each other? Because if it's only for a rhetorical show,
Right. Then nothing
then
is
we
happening.
lose.
Exactly.
And I think Carmichael was doing a couple of things. I think he was forcing folk to say, we have to give attention to the individual self and the collective Black self. We
Right.
have to give a commitment to a Booker T. Washington. Yeah, we may not agree with all of his politics, but what other Black man has created an institution with longevity, right? We have to look at someone like Anna Cooper and all the years she dedicated to teaching Black children um, in DC, right? In the ways in which she institutionalized a certain kind of rigorous learning. And part of what that consciousness idea, well, what does it mean, right, to acknowledge white supremacy, to acknowledge the external world, but also to create the very conditions where we can govern what our healing looks like, where we can govern what consciousness looks like, and we determine, right, whether or not the Black consciousness that we're calling for is correct for us as a collective and as individuals.
I think it's safe to say that we probably would not agree with everyone's politics, right?
Yeah, yeah,
There's going to be something about something that you say or I say that somebody's not going to agree with. But there are some things that we will agree with. And I think that we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are things that, as you say, we can wrestle with and talk about how we can get on common ground, find the places that we can get on common ground with so that we can do something. But I think a lot of times what has happened amongst us is that because we don't agree with one thing, or we don't agree with two things. I see it happening now, and this is, just even within our party. Every time people go to speak to Black people, and they go to Black churches that are on the conservative side, well, there are two issues that come up all the time. Those two issues are LGBTQI people, and the second one is abortion. And those are the bailiwicks that people use, right, constantly to separate and divide. And I think that we've got to find another way in which we navigate those waters so that we're not divided.
And I would also argue that we have to begin to talk to the people and not assume that scholarly studies, that folk who are not in the community, whether they're Black, brown, or other, can determine what's actually happening. Because I want to argue that I don't think we've actually talked to the people to
Yeah.
find out what they really think. I remember in the late 1990s, I talked to a group of Black women at AME Church in Roxbury, all right, right outside of Boston. And I assumed these were very rigid. They were, mothers. They were deaconesses. They were, they had the whole thing. And we're like, what is a problem with the women preaching? What is a problem with sexuality?
Right.
She's like, I want to know, do they love the Lord? And I'm thinking, well, if you're telling me this, why aren't you telling the pastor? So why is the pastor saying he can't say this because you guys will object? And so part of it is, I don't think we actually are interviewing the people to find out what exactly do you believe in terms of the Bible and sexuality, or the Bible and gender. I think we're making a lot of assumptions, right, based on the ways in which we assume we come in and we teach the people. Taylor Baker taught us that, no, you go in to learn from the people and say, look, we've been blessed to be at a Morehouse, to be at a Spelman, a Prairie Review, or a Harvard. And now we're going to find out, what do you need? But too often we go back trying to teach people.
Yes.
And tell them what they actually need.
Yes. That's so good. I hope y'all listening tonight. This brother's on fire, Dr. Terrence Johnson, talking about his book. And I want y'all to make sure you get it. Pastor Sue, let's throw it up there one more time. We testify with our lives how religion transformed radical thought from Black power to Black lives matter. This book is worth getting. This book is worth purchasing. I want you all to consider purchasing it for someone else if you don't just purchase it for yourself. And certainly there is going to be a book giveaway, the hashtag Beyond the Gatekeepers. That is what you want to use. Make sure that you spell it correctly in order to be entered at the end of the evening. But yeah, I like the way you said that. We have to start talking to people, right? Not talking over people, not talking at people, but actually listening to what people have to say, not necessarily what the pastor has to say, but what are the people saying? What are the congregants saying? What are like the mother from the church? She has something to say. And what was coming across that pulpit is not what that mother said.
Yeah, and too often our seminarians say, well, we can't say this to the church. And I'm like, now I'm going to say, you're not telling the truth.
Yeah.
Because I've talked to people. I haven't done a systematic study, but I've talked to enough people to know that you're not really talking to them.
Yeah.
You're making a whole lot of assumptions.
Yes. I love that. Thank you so much. I want to move on. I know, like I told you when we before, that we probably would not get through the whole book, but I want people to really want to purchase it. Let's talk about MLK Jr.'s religious radicalism. You bring that up. You talk about how at this time people are protesting the Vietnam War, but we have some of the same conditions right here in America that you all are not saying anything about across these houses of worship. Tell us a little bit about that.
No, I mean, like Mike Eric Dyson and other folk, I really want to show how King had a deep relationship with the Black radical left for a long time, and that they were deeply influencing how he was imagining the world. And even my mentor, Beverly Guy Shefter, argues that Coretta Scott King also played a huge role, right, and forcing King to deal with gender, right? To deal with issues around sexuality, to deal with class also. And so I wanted to show how Riverside was a kind of culmination of so many other events. And that in some ways, this idea of using the speech in the ways in which silence, right, as a kind of ethical choice, right, is in some ways speaking louder than even our rhetoric, speaking louder than even the ways in which, right, we scream about what we need. And part of what I wanted to show also is this idea that leadership can evolve, can deepen, it can expand, and that leadership is complicated.
It
And
is.
part of what it means, I think, to be a kind of an active member of any community is to begin to recognize all the nuances. And again, I think we do it all the time in terms of our relationships with people in the community, right? But we don't necessarily do it with our leadership in part because we still look up. And
Yes.
part of what the Riverside speech does, in some ways, it really levels and in some ways puts King in a position where he's now being criticized by the very folk who in some ways lifted him up, right?
Yes.
As a kind of spokesperson. Now, folks like the New York Times are saying, wait, why is this Negro talking about international issues? And I want to say, well, if you know Black history, we've always been an international people. And one aspect of the book that I think that King sets up is this idea that, well, Black power was about human rights activism. It was about
Yes.
using the race problem in America to speak more clearly about a broader race problem that was global, right?
Yes.
And Du Bois and others, Claudia Jones, also dealt with this issue in the early 1900s to say, no, let's meet with the Pan African Council and let's talk about this, right? Amongst a globally rich and linguistically diverse people. And I want us at this moment to recognize that as we march and protest about Gaza, we
Hmm.
also have to begin to talk about Haiti, right?
Yes. And
And why
Congo.
and why do we ignore Haiti, which is like a rock's throw away? Why are we ignoring what's happening
Yeah.
in the Congo or in Nigeria? What is it
Absolutely.
about blackness that still, in some ways, creates a kind of shield, that
Yeah.
kind of
Some
barrier?
very. You don't hear people talk about it here every now and then. I know some people that are, talking about it, but it's silence.
You know,
And I
and
and I
King, in
don't
some
know it
ways, yeah,
because
yeah,
people are like feeling like, but this is not happening over here. That's
yeah, yeah,
happening over there. Right.
yes,
And I
yeah.
think that proximity may have something to do with it, may not. I'm not sure of the reasons, but you are very, very spot on.
My friend Diane Stewart at Emory really wonders, what is this a kind of internal anti-blackness that we have yet to reckon with? Even my African friends are saying, Terrence, we want more Black Americans. He's in Nigeria to really to help us think about our institutions, to help
Yeah.
us think about how do we actually build something,
Yeah.
given the ways in which nationalism, white nationalism around the world is creeping up. We saw what just happened in France, right?
Yes.
I mean, it is, if we have our eyes open, a terrible, to put it very mildly,
Yeah.
time for folk of color.
It
And I think
is.
we're going to see for women,
Hmm.
and we know who's next, right?
Yes.
LGBTQ plus communities. I mean,
Absolutely.
the ways in which the legal system are beginning to think about or not thinking about reproductive justice, right?
Yes.
Again, all kind of reckonings, and this idea of we testify that I get the phrase from I borrowed from Audre Lorde. It's like we haven't had military power. And I'm not sure we actually always even wanted military power,
Yeah.
and yet we always demonstrated with our lives our faith, our commitment to humanity. Even when humanity, quote, rejected us, we as a people, right,
Yes.
found ways to, in some ways, think about the old song that Mahalia Jackson was singing, there are many mansions, right? We
Yes.
always knew there were many, many rooms, right, in the mansions that are prepared for us. And so the question becomes, how do we politicize that in ways in which speak to how we need to create a generation of leaders who are thinking about the kind of global beloved community that King really set the stage for.
Yes. Malcolm X. Malcolm X and the spiritual of humanistic activism.
Yeah, I was really, and again, one of those chapters I wish I could kind of just dive into a bit more. But again, as I mentioned earlier, what I found interesting is that when he spoke about, right, the beauty of blackness, alongside a very kind of radical politics. One, it happened often in Black churches. Often he talked through Black biblical characters. And in many respects, right, there's a way in which he embodied the kind of genius of Black life and masculinity in ways that did not erase women or did not erase, right, the other that I think Black folk found rejuvenating, right? There's something about the depth and the tone of his voice that magnified, right, his piercing words, his sort of brilliant way and mastery with words and a preacherly kind of rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
And and again, this is something I've been reading in other works, but there's something about the way we perform Blackness, particularly those who are clergy, particularly those who are artists, right, who are musicians, that there's a way in which Aretha Franklin, I don't talk about this in the book, but I thought about it in terms of how she performed a kind of Black gospel aesthetic, even as she talked about loving her man or wanting a certain kind of respect.
Absolutely.
That I'm thinking it wasn't simply in the words, but it's in the tone, it's in the body. And that's what I think Malcolm X really embraced. That's what made him so dangerous is that Hoover and others are like, how do we control someone
Absolutely.
whose very interiority,
Mm-hmm.
right, is in some way stepping out before him and pulling in the people.
They call that
And
word
that's
interiority.
interiority. And I wonder, and again, I'm not here to criticize Obama in any way because I think that's a different conversation. But I wonder the ways in which, how did that initial conversation of Obama in terms of hope, did that or did it not speak to a Black interiority? What was it about him that galvanized even folk in Germany with this really interesting, really very problematic history, where when he went to speak, was it 200,000 folk came out to the same plaza where Hitler gathered folk? I mean, there's something about that early kind of sort of rhetoric that he built upon from a Jeremiah Wright, right? That he borrows from Black church traditions.
Absolutely.
That
It's
spoke
a
to folk.
kind of performance.
And the question is, how do we use that performance not in ways to gut our resources, but how do we use it actually to build the resources so that the people can actually get what they need? Because too many of us just use it as a way, right, to build up our own, right, personal bank account.
Absolutely.
But I think Malcolm demonstrated you can actually use your interiority, use what we call charisma, use your soul to replenish the people, which is why folk are still talking about Malcolm X. Because he's still replenishing their souls that I would argue are still broken, still very tender.
Yes, I love that. And I know I'm continuing to move through the book because I desperately want to get to the end of the chapter. I really do. I want to talk about humanistic nationalism and the ethical turn.
Yes,
Get right into it.
No, and so part of what I argue is that often when we look at Black power, we think about it's sort of the binary of it's against civil rights movement. And I really want to argue that no, it was an extension of this humanistic kind of rhetoric that we heard with Malcolm X, and it really speaks to a kind of ways in which Black power wanted to make material that interiority that we had for so many years either ignored or witnessed sort of the ridicule of, through ethnographies that talked about the ways in which our practices were ape-like, our practices were somehow less than, weren't as intellectually as rigorous, that jazz was simply some kind of, juke joint music that didn't have any kind of intellectual rigor to it, like say classical music. And so I want to show how that the Black power was multifaceted and really wanted to speak to a broader movement that some might argue sort of waned after Trans-Africa's great success with helping to end apartheid. So that's why I wanted to speak to the kind of humanistic nationalism.
But you also talked about SNCC and the International Affairs Commission in New York City and the Third World Women's Alliance. You made mention of them, how they had already been advocating for human rights activism in Vietnam and in South Africa, and that it was Black women.
Yes.
Black women.
No, Black women were the ones who were like Malcolm X. don't get caught up in this America thing until you understand what's happening in the world,
Absolutely.
right? Black women, um, oh gosh, Edith, I think of Edith's last name in a moment, but Stokely Carmichael's editor
Hmm.
pushed him, right, to think about the ways in which, right, um, global politics must become central in any kind of race politics in the U.S. And you can't simply think about race outside of the Caribbean, outside of South Africa, outside of the European context.
I love that you make mention of Francis Beale, Mae Jackson,
But this, yes,
and,
yes,
and how they designed and developed and led conversations around imperialism and global racism and
yes.
sexism and anti-colonialism. And these women was on the ball. These
No, they were on
women,
the ball. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
and
and
they
you
were
know,
guiding,
yeah,
the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They were pushing. They all had worked with Ella Baker, whose work is extraordinary. Whom I didn't give justice to in part because so many people have done so many great
sure,
books on her already. But you're right. I mean, Black women were unfortunately always in the background, but
yes,
always very central in terms of you look at the archives of SNCC and archives of other organizations, they're pushing and saying, what about these other issues? And again, that's part of what's missing in our public conversation now. We're only thinking about right the border, only thinking about Trump. It's these binary issues that don't speak to the richness of what's happening in ordinary folks' lives.
yeah, yeah. SNCC's Palestinian problem. So I want to
Wow.
say this because I feel like people think that the Palestinian issue is something that has just come about.
Hmm.
This Palestinian issue has been going on and on and on for decades.
Yes, yes, yes.
So
No, since the question of Israel emerged in the mid 1920s and 30s, and even with Zionist writings, right? A number of black men, including Du Bois and Carmichael and Marcus Garvey, all felt like Zionism, right, in some ways would help save the world because early Zionism, really, in their our understandings, really spoke to this idea of how do we actually help to save humankind? How do we create societies in which cooperation is not simply mediated through capitalism, but mediated through labor, right, through collective labor, through collective sharing. And Du Bois wrote that, now with the rise of Israel, right, in 48, we will actually see how we can serve, he says, quote, mankind through health with rigorous health care, right, with fair wages. I mean,
yes,
he went on and on. And so you see that these are people who are who read about global issues, right? Carmichael and others are meeting with students from the Arab American League and American
yes,
Association. I mean, they're traveling to the Middle East, they're having conversations. These aren't people who are simply understanding the world based on conversations with folk at the barbershop. They're traveling.
they're
They're
trying.
engaged in conversation, right? They're writing to folk in South Africa. And so I wanted to show that we are far more complicated. We have such an incredible history that we are barely even we barely know the extent to which Black folk have been involved in so many global controversies, so many global issues. And I wanted to speak to that. Um, so the Palestinian problem was really interesting because it forced, SNCC to say, well, look, we love having our Jewish brothers and sisters involved, but what we learned from our brothers and sisters is that if we don't take care of our communities, we will fail.
Yes,
And what they noticed in the mid 60s is that what seems as if white Jews are benefiting in far more ways than us from the civil rights activism that we have collectively worked together to achieve. And so there's this question of, well, do we continue down a path in which we're fighting for rights, but we're not benefiting from it? We're not
right,
benefiting from economic or political realities that we have fought hard for. And I think with that conversation, and also again, in some ways modeling themselves after the ways in Jewish communities were sort of self-contained, right?
yes,
And also provided the economic and social means for the communities to survive. Those conversations happen during 67, 68 war, when we see, right, the implosion of the Middle East, and Carmichael and others are saying, well, wait a minute. Edith Minor, right, was one of the major writers of the Palestinian problem and of the writings that influenced Stokely Carmichael's position. They're saying, wait a minute. We supported a Zionism that embraced a broad community. What we see now looks like a new colonial power. because
Yes.
now we're seeing Ashkenazi Jews in positions of power, right, receiving arms and talking negotiations with South Africa, the apartheid state, right, fighting against an indigenous people, who through their eyes appear to be brown. So it appears to be the colonial kind of colonized kind of context. And people can debate the veracity of that. But when they saw that, they wanted to kind of think through it. And unfortunately, the paper that was released was a work in progress. It was something that they were negotiating, still trying to write out all the details. When it was released, well, like a lot of very strong black men, they're going to say, "Well, we're going to stand by it no matter what." And so they stood by it, and then again, it created a total eruption. And again, people condemned SNCC for being anti-Semitic, condemned SNCC for for sticking its nose in international affairs where it didn't belong. And so you're right; it speaks to how when we are at the barbershop, at the beauty shop, in our churches, in our mosques, and when folk ask us, "Well, why do you care about X or Y?" You can say, "Well, because it's in our blood."
Absolutely.
Why do you care about those people? They're not in your family. It's because it's in our blood. That
Mhm.
we have a long history of fighting for people who are not like us,
Yes.
quote
And
unquote.
yeah, absolutely. And we have, Ethel Minor is her name, and she was the
Yes,
Secretary of Communications,
yes, yes,
lead writer. And it was because of that very consequential newsletter that she put together
yes,
that led a lot of Black U.S. political organizations to
yeah,
open up their eyes and say, listen,
yeah,
hey, this woman is onto something and we need to
yeah,
investigate. And she had a one of them titled, I think, Third World Roundup and
yes,
uh,
yes, yes,
the
yeah,
Palestine problem, test your knowledge.
yes,
Like she
yes,
was on it, giving them the information that they needed, but also expressing unequivocally SNCC's anti-war position. She was
yes,
letting
yes,
say we're going
yeah,
to condemn it. We're condemning European Jews for settling Palestinian land, and all of it encompassed. And so, yet again, a woman bringing it to the forefront, even though it was probably a woman carried the water, but it was actually men that were actually acknowledged for this.
no. And Etamano, again, an incredible figure. And when I wrote the book, because it was during COVID, she was alive. I'm not sure if she is now in Chicago, but she didn't want to have a conversation. I understand.
Um, I
Um,
see.
but I believe she's like the first cousin to Francis Cress Wellesley, the incredible
Oh,
psychiatrist
yes, absolutely.
um, from Howard University, and so and she spent time at Howard University speaking. And so there's so many women like that who were part of the humanistic sort of turn and ethical turn within Black power that I wanted to at least in my sort of philosophical way, 'cause I'm not a historian, sort of pay tribute to, and yet there's still
Sure.
so much work to be done. And again, part of the message is simple, but it's also sort of difficult to embrace. This idea that for people who have suffered for so long,
Yeah.
right? Even those who quote unquote make it, we still carry folk. We still send money home, right? We still are praying for relatives who are in jail. We're still, fighting battles when folk have to go to the doctor and say, okay, how do we interpret this from 500 miles away?
Yeah.
And yet, because of that, we often don't acknowledge, right, this idea of what does it mean to sort of embrace a stranger? Because we seem as if we're so burdened by our own familiar issues, our own professional concerns. And part of what I was trying to not necessarily say, but show is that we have always, as you mentioned, had both and we've always juggled nuance. And so I don't want people to ever say, well, Black folk were myopic, Black folk, or no, we have never been one thing.
Yes.
And so don't allow people to define who we are because we have an extraordinary history, a
Yeah.
history that is committed to democracy, but also committed to telling the truth about war, about violence. And I hope this is simply a starting point for richer conversation. A whole lot of folk who are doing this, but I want to play my part and show, look, many of these folks appear to be respectable, right?
Yes.
And because they appear to be respectable, they could kind of pass under the radar. The
Hmm.
spook who sat by the door, you could just sit there. Folks don't even know you're there. And the
Yes.
next thing you know, there's a revolution.
Yep.
And so I think we have to embrace ourselves in ways that acknowledges that the one who looks like Uncle Tom may not be as Uncle Tom as Maya Angelou mentioned. These
Mm,
men who said that our submission made this possible, right?
mm,
Understood the radicality, right? of performing, of wearing masks,
Mm-hmm.
of having multiplicity in one sort of nature.
Yeah.
And now this idea that you share everything on social media, you're always taking pictures, it's like, oh, it's so dull, it's so boring. Because we are far more complicated than what this sort of socially engineered new technology wants us to
Absolutely.
believe.
Absolutely. Your last chapter, The Religion of Black Power.
Yeah. Well, my grandmother thankfully did not read that. I don't think she'll be very happy with me. But I remember, I was thinking when I thought about the chapter, I was thinking about how, whenever I went to get my grandmother riled up, I'd say, "Oh," I call her Medill. Medill, you know, why don't you believe in women pastors? Oh no, that's not in the scripture. I don't think I can sit under women pastors. I said, but what do you mean? People call you when they have a dream and you interpret them. When they're sick, you put together a remedy. Is that Christian? She said, "Oh, get out of here, boy. That doesn't make any sense to me." And part of what I wanted to show is that yes, she said she was against women ministers, but she would not walk out of a church because a woman minister was there,
Right.
right? It was like a rhetorical kind of response that, in some ways, cast a veil over a far more nuanced, right, theology. Again, I'm not trying to say that was right. I'm not trying to pacify it, and
Sure.
yet, in some ways, she used it as a kind of mask to kind of shield her other behavior that would have
Gonna
caused all
get
kind of
you. She
ire.
gonna get you, Terrence. I'm telling you right now. If she
well,
watched
no,
this, she gonna be like, I'm gonna get that boy.
well, no, I pray, and she is with me, right? Whenever I speak, I always think of her, and
Wonderful.
I know that her strength is with me at that
Yes.
place called Harvard, where, as we
Yes.
all know, we witnessed a great deal of tragedy this year.
Yes. Yes.
And there's no doubt in my mind, right, that I jokingly say this, but I know she is just pleased with the fact that I shared, not, I didn't share something to kind of to talk about, this folk experience, but to talk about this is this incredible knowledge, right, that my little family has. I think it's in everybody's family. I mean, even
Absolutely.
Ruth Simmons talks about this idea of how her I think either great grandmother or grandmother would
Hmm.
wear white, and what
Yes.
that signified for these workers who were sharecroppers.
Yeah.
And I just want to say, look, don't condemn the so-called unlettered folk in our community, right?
Love
Don't
that.
condemn those who don't walk in our hallways, because there's so much brilliance sitting at our table where we're just, I remember as a kid eating like milk and bread sometimes because that's what we had.
Hmm.
And what does it mean to sit in those spaces with these wise keepers, folk that everybody ignore, who will call them by their first name? I get so upset. Why are you calling my grandmother by her first name? It's Mrs. Johnson to you. And yet
That's
this woman, despite the kind of ongoing um, disrespect,
right. Yeah.
found ways to really create beauty, as Alice Walker said, right? You
Mhm.
find beauty in your womanist thought. You find beauty right in your community. And I think that as Black men, we have to find a way to embrace, right, the ways in which Black women have sustained us, and how we need their knowledge, right, to fuel, right, our masculinity. And
Yeah.
maybe masculinity in 20 years we will reject.
Right.
But what we call our force, our strength, we can't do it in a way in which it's only in a kind of male centered space, because we need only men understand certain issues. I want to push back and say, well, maybe yes, maybe not. And
Hmm.
also, there are a whole lot of problems that emerge in these sort of spaces that we need to acknowledge. And so I don't want to go deep down that route, but I want to say that the religion of Black power comes from many of these women. And I mentioned my great grandfather,
Yeah.
who was also a seer. And again, I never know what was real or not. My grandma was like, yeah, he and his wife made their living,
Yeah.
because a lot of white folk will come in and say, well, what, I lost my cow, or my wife's sick, or I'm
Mhm.
concerned my wife might be stepping out, right?
Mhm.
That's how they made their money, as they went to church every Sunday,
Yeah. Sure.
as they farmed.
Yeah. Because it was a part of their DNA. That was a
Yes,
gift that
yes,
your grandparents
yes,
had. They wasn't
yes,
swindling folks, because the folks wouldn't keep coming back if it wasn't true,
yes,
right? They wouldn't be
yes,
telling other folks, "Go see my dear
yes,
down the road. She got something for you. She knows what to tell you." You know what I
yes,
mean?
yes,
I know that my grandmother and them, they all did the same.
yes,
My mother and they all did the same. they would go to the reader, the seer. The seer said so and so and so. The reader said Vanessa wasn't going to school for 45 days.
Wow.
And on the day that my mother went to the reader, she decided to go to the school and see if I was there. I wasn't even in school that day, Dr. Terrence.
Wow. Wow.
And they were right. I hadn't been to school.
Wow.
And she went and she looked and she said, "What address do you have?" And she looked for the address, and the address was not mine, not hers. Someone else's. All of my cutting cards and all of my absentee cards were going someplace else. So my mother wouldn't find out. But something made her not go to work that day and go see a reader. And that reader said, "Your daughter's not going to school."
Wow. Wow.
So I know they exist. I mean, I can go all the way back. I use myself as an example, but go back to other things and people in the South that did readings for my mother, and my grandmother helped them to do readings as well. Certain things that they would tell you to do about taking water and something and put it under your bed, all kind of different things. Listen, if you don't believe it, it's okay. I tell people that all the time, but it worked for them. And it was a part of that interiority that helped them sustain and helped them to make it.
Yeah. And even if you don't believe it, attend to it, grapple with it. Don't simply dismiss it. I mean, we attend to a whole lot of other logics, right, around categories that are useless, right, that simply fill up airtime in conferences. So if we can devote our time to these religious conferences that do nothing for our communities, why not look at Tony Gay Bombara? Why not look at Zora Neale Hurston, right, who's in some way who's an ethnographer, but also has been initiated as well into these systems to really understand what's happening in these cultures, what's happening to folk who are sanctified, but also possessed by these other spirits. What does that look like? What does that mean for people? And again, I don't think I'm not attempting to argue that you go back to reclaim something, but you go back to learn, to engage. And it's through that engagement, some people call there's a rupture that happens, right? And it's through that rupturing, right, where the very possibility of extending what we know can take us in different directions, right? Or it can simply sustain us, but we can't know the answer if we don't grapple with it. And just end with, Toni Morrison, I think is so powerful in part because she says, I want to write for the people, and I want to assume that where I sit is at the center. And part of, I think, what we have to claim as a people is this idea: how do we sit at the center? Without worrying about what white folk are saying or what other folk are saying about their communities or saying about us. How do we sit at the center and then tell the truthfulness of our story, recognizing that truthfulness is always very complicated, right? Always varied. And yet I'm convinced that when we speak from the truthfulness of our narratives, of our traditions, that's when the door is open, right? That's when the windows of heaven can open. That's when I think new possibilities happen.
I love that. Dr. Terrence, one last thing. If you had to leave last words for us, it's a number of people that are watching now, but there are a number of people that will watch later, and this lives online. What would you want to say to them?
I'd want to bring this idea of silence that Audre Lorde talks about in conversation with, Howard Thurman's notion of deep is the hunger.
Yes.
And what does it mean for people who are longing, who are hungry, right, for that which might be inarticulable, which we know, but yet are either fearful or cannot articulate. And my prayer is that we will nurture our deep hunger, right, by a kind of return and by kind of naming and by articulating, right, who we are as a people through the very texts, right, that inform who we are and that we'll use that as a starting point. In some ways, to bear witness to our incredible lives that are not incredible because we're an individual, but incredible because of our ancestors and because of the various struggles. Incredible because we are still here despite the onslaught against us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Terrence Johnson. Powerful. We
But
won't.
thank you so much for the invitation, and to Dr. Flunder, who's not here, and to Mother Lucky. Again, I'm very grateful, and I love speaking to people who assume the very best, because their presence is also often an acknowledgement that we care, we're
Yes.
proud of you, and we want to just simply sit. And so, thank all of you who came, and it's really an honor. And I pray that I can help, and this book provides you with the resources that you need for your life and for your intellectual growth.
Excellent. Thank you all for joining in. We have two advertisements that we want to show, and then we're going to go directly to our book giveaway. So thank you for joining Beyond the Gatekeepers, where there are current events through a theological and justice-informed lens. You all know that we talk about politics and religion and sex and sexuality and race. We're so glad that you join in with us on a weekly basis. We want you to support our broadcast by sending a donation to $Cash App. I'm sorry, to $TFAM Annual, or to our PayPal at www.paypal.me/TFAM Justice. So again, it's our Cash App at $TFAM Annual, or it is our PayPal, and our PayPal is www.paypal.me/TFAM Justice. We appreciate your gifts in the ways that you already give to us very much. And we want you to save the date, August 5th through the 9th. Bishop Yvette Flunder, who is our presiding bishop of the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, we will be having our leadership conference in Las Vegas, Nevada, at the Palms Casino Resort Hotel in Las Vegas. There's an early bird registration that is $200, and it ends June 19th. There's regular registration that is $300 after that date. You can go to www.radicallyinclusive.com. If I'm not mistaken. I know that it's what it should be. And go there. Our theme is, www.radicallyinclusive.org. www.radicallyinclusive.org. Our theme is Something Inside So Strong. Everything I just said is on that website. You can register, find out about the hotel. All of the things that you want to know are there. Thank you so very, very much. And so those of you that want to win, I know that you do, make sure you put hashtag Beyond the Gatekeepers. It is spelled out for you on the screen. So I want you to type it the way that you see it so that you can win the opportunity, or that you can get the opportunity to win a book on tonight. If you don't win the book, you will see where to purchase the book. It is all listed down in the chat area. So we want to make sure that you can see that. I see that people are putting it in right now. We're going to wait a few minutes for you to get an opportunity to put it in there. Desiree Fryson, thank you for joining us tonight. There's some Reverend Dr. Tracy Denise Swire, thank you for being here. Rosalind Phillips, thank you for being here tonight. Kenya Hatcher, thank you for being here tonight. Sherry Dampier, thank you for being here tonight. So these are people that I've seen that have come in since the last time I said, shouted out people. Sierra Grace sings. Bless you, Sierra. Thank you so much for being here. Bishop Stefan E. Love Brinson, thank you for being here tonight. And I love you too. All right. We want to make sure that you've got it in there. Hashtag Beyond the Gatekeepers, because we're getting ready to go. All right. Pastor Sue. Ha! Congratulations, Professor Natasha Robinson. You are the winner tonight of this book, and we celebrate with you. We say congratulations. Please make sure you go into our inbox, put your name and your full name and your address so that we can make sure that we get it to Dr. Terrence, and he can get that book out to you. Dr. Terrence, you are beloved in our community. We say thank you very much for joining us. And we certainly look forward to talking to you again, because you have several other books, and I know that I want to bring you back. Thank you so very much, Dr. Terrence.
Great. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We say God bless you and have a wonderful evening.